We are now 2 decades removed from the 90s and can really start to appreciate what had a lasting impact from those wild 10 years. I was 17 by the time the 90s ended, so you can say they had a big influence on me. So of course this list will be skewed by my experience, but I am taking into consideration all things 90s that had a cultural significance, as well as just overall good design by Funko. So no poorly designed pops will be on this list. But before I get into the top 10, I want to talk about some honorable mentions. Arguably the biggest movie star to come out of the 90s was Leonardo DiCaprio, and he has a couple of good Funko Pops. One of them is the Chase Romeo from Romeo plus Juliet. In my opinion, one of the best chases that Funko has ever made. And also the Rose and Jack 2-pack from Titanic, which at the time was the most profitable, biggest, most popular movie of all time. Until it was dethroned by Avatar, I believe. But in the 90s, Titanic was just a really big deal. Stone Cold Steve Austin, the Texas Rattlesnake. From the mid-90s onward, you couldn't go anywhere without seeing at least one person wearing a Stone Cold 316 shirt. He was just insanely popular, and I really like this pop of him. It's the newer one holding the belt, instantly recognizable. The Beavis and Butthead pops are extremely pricey now. They're some of Funko's earliest pops, and they really made an effort to make it look like them. They don't have the typical Funko nose. The heads are elongated. Very, very difficult designs to turn into Funko Pops, and they did a pretty good job with it. I can't think of how they could have done these any better than what they did. When I think about the 90s, one of the people I think about is Alicia Silverstone, and her most iconic role was definitely Cher from Clueless. Super memorable movie, lots of catchphrases, very memorable style, and just very funny. If I had to pick one movie that had the biggest influence on everything that came out after it, it would definitely be Pulp Fiction. It made Sam Jackson a household name, and as of now, he is the highest grossing movie star of all time. And him as Jules is still his most iconic role. Maybe not for the younger generations, but if you were alive in the 90s, this is how you see Sam Jackson, as Jules from Pulp Fiction. There was also a really big comic boom and resurgence in the 90s, and arguably the most popular superheroes were the X-Men, with the animated show, and also some of the highest selling comic books of all time. And no individual Funko Pop is all that great, right? There's no really big showstoppers, but when you put the collection all together, it looks really nice. Funko was very faithful to these 90s X-Men designs. Pokemon now is probably even more popular than it was in the 90s, but that's when it was really born. And honestly, maybe it's only slightly more popular now because Pokemon was all over the place. But I do find the Funko Pops a little underwhelming, but I do find the big gigantic 18-inch Pikachu pretty cool. But only because it's so huge, because I still think the designs could be a lot better. Alright, now on to the best of the best, starting at number 10. Some of the longest running TV shows of all time were born in the 90s, and one of them is South Park. Now the Pops are very simple. When they first came out, a lot of people really just didn't like them. But I thought they were near perfect. The original South Park designs are super simple. They were from construction paper. Not the easiest thing in the world to adapt. But Funko did a great job, especially when you put the four boys together like this. It looks just like the iconic pose of them just standing, waiting for the bus. They're perfect. They look like the characters. They look like Funko Pops because the heads aren't exactly 100% round. The only thing that's unfortunate is that they didn't just make a regular Cartman. He's holding Clyde Frog here. It would have been cool to just make him with his hands to the side, but that's a small nitpick because the Clyde Frog is cool. And also, Funko just never made a 4-pack. They really should have made a 4-pack with the four boys, with an insert that had snowy pines and mountains. That would have been great. And similar to the X-Men, there's not one South Park pop that's particularly show-stopping. They look great all together, but if you're gonna have a 90s collection, you gotta have the original four boys from South Park. Speaking of the longest running shows of all time, The Simpsons. Believe it or not, it was super controversial at the time. They had Simpsons merch everywhere. People would constantly repeat the catchphrases. It might have been the biggest show from the 90s when you really think about it. And really, I'm kind of putting the whole Simpsons line in this spot. But one I particularly like is the comic book guy because I think is really well done. The Simpsons Pops are pretty simple, but I like the detail of the comic book being put into the plastic protective sleeve and him wearing the white glove. Some nice details, but I especially like that it represents The Simpsons, of course, but also the big comic book boom of the 90s. I feel that if comic books weren't as big as they were in the 90s, we wouldn't have the Marvel Cinematic Universe as we know it now. The reason comic book movies are so big now is because all the kids that grew up in the 90s reading comic books are now old enough to be the main consumers of this stuff, along with their children, of course. But now, something like the Avengers appeals also to adults and not just children and teenagers. The 90s laid the groundwork for it. So that's why I'm picking the comic book guy to represent the Simpsons line. There's been many great battles. Xbox or PlayStation, Coke or Pepsi, DC or Marvel. But one of the biggest battles of the 90s was East Coast versus West Coast. It seemed like a lot of people couldn't just like the Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac the same. Always arguments about who was better, Tupac or Biggie. And at the time, maybe Tupac was more popular than Biggie. But I think the Notorious B.I.G.'s music has definitely aged better than Tupac's. And these two Funko Pops are pretty perfect. It's Notorious B.I.G. from the Big Papa video, which is how he was kind of introduced to most people, and Tupac from the All Eyes on Me era, which is one of the biggest albums of all time. All the details on these pops are just right. They look really good. They're instantly recognizable. I just love these two Funko Pops. The horror genre was dead until Scream came along and just reinvigorated the slasher genre. And of course it was funny, but it was just one of those movies that didn't have the biggest box office returns, but word of mouth spread until eventually everybody saw this movie. It's still popular to this day. I mean, we're still getting collectibles of Ghostface. He's right up there with Michael Myers and Jason and all the other horror icons. It's definitely my favorite horror movie. And I mean, how many other horror movies have spawned actual TV shows? And honestly, Funko did a great job with the pop. At the time that this was made, Funko Pops didn't have all that much detail, but this pop really stands out with the bloody knife. And Ghostface himself is just really recognizable. But I really like the glossy paint on the gloves and the boots and the belt, instead of just making it all flat black. For the longest time, this pop was pretty cheap, but now he's very expensive, which just goes to show how popular Ghostface and Scream still are today. So arcades were still very popular in the 90s, and two of the most popular machines there were the Street Fighter 2 and Mortal Kombat games. And maybe I'm just an old fart, but to me, the best versions of these games were still the ones from the 90s. Just totally iconic. I loved Street Fighter 2 and the original two Mortal Kombats. And as far as the pops go, I think Chun-Li from Street Fighter 2 is the best one. She just looks super good. And Scorpion from Mortal Kombat looks so perfect. Definitely one of my favorite pops in my collection. I wish Funko would have continued these lines and made every single character from the original Street Fighter 2 and original Mortal Kombat game. Rachel Green from Friends. This is just a human pop, but one of the most instantly recognizable human pops when you take it out of the box that Funko has ever made. And of course it says Central Perk on her apron and on the mug, but it's that hair. If you were alive in the 90s, this was one of the first memes, was the Rachel Green haircut. It seemed like 50% of the women cut their hair like Rachel Green and try to act like, it wasn't influenced by her, they just did it. And it's kind of weird to think about, but I honestly think it's one of the most influential haircuts ever. But besides the meme of the haircut, the show Friends was a phenomenon just like South Park, just like Simpsons. People got together to have little parties when the new Friends episodes were on. Even to this day, I'm surprised by how many people are very, very hardcore fans of Friends that weren't even born in the 90s. There aren't too many shows like that. And to me, the best pop out of the whole series is this Rachel Green. When somebody says the early 90s to you, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? For me, it's grunge music. And when you think about grunge music, you think about Nirvana. Now, all the Kurt Cobain pops are really cool. And I've previously put the Kurt Cobain from the Smells Like Teen Spirit video on my best music pops of all time list, but for this one, I'm going to pick the one from In Utero. I really like the pink guitar, I like the details on the shirt, everything about the pop is great. Funko did a wonderful job with the Kurt Cobain pops, and they're all very expensive now, because Kurt Cobain was very popular, but also because they designed them really well. If these came out really bad, they wouldn't be as pricey as they are now, just because Kurt Cobain was popular. Part of what makes a very expensive pop is the execution, and Funko did a really great job with this. Now, one of my dream pops that they could make would be to make the anatomical, scientific organ statue thing. I'm not sure what you call that. I'm just going to call it the anatomical angel. I wish Funko would make her. Kind of like how they made Lady Justice from the Metallica album. I would want them to do the same thing, but for Nirvana's In Utero. That would just be amazing. Zack Morris from Saved by the Bell. If you were a kid in the 90s, Saved by the Bell was your jam. I used to love this show. I feel like everybody did. And Zack, of course, was a personification of what kids thought was cool. The clothes, the hair, the attitude, the hot chick liked him. He had the sneaks, and of course, that big early 90s brick of a phone. Even the box art on this pop is great. I really love this one. The Power Rangers was such a gigantic hit in the 90s that this goofy ass show for children was aired during prime time. That's how popular it was. And the whole Green Ranger story arc blew every child's mind. It was so cool. My favorite Ranger was the Green Ranger. Tommy was just badass. And everybody had a crush on the Pink Ranger and Tommy got her. The whole Power Ranger set looks good. And I actually like the original commons. I think the paint jobs on the commons look the best and the closest to the originals. More so than the metallics and all that. Just the original commons look the best. And the Green Ranger's helmet design is just really amazing. And it really translated well into pop form. This is a definite must-have for a 90s collection. And what could possibly be number one? That's Michael Jordan, of course. There was nobody more famous and more popular in the 90s than Michael Jordan. To me, never was basketball more exciting than watching the Michael Jordan Bulls, with Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman as well. But it was the Jordan Show. The greatest basketball player of all time. He was constantly all over the media, all over advertisements. I don't know if it was an urban legend or not, but one of the things that people used to talk about was how much money Michael Jordan used to make, like, per minute or per second. People would go, oh, he makes $2,000 a second. No, he makes $23,000 a second. Who knows what it really was? But that's how famous this guy was. Still is. I mean, look how many Funko Pops of him there are. What other athlete has that many Funko Pops? If it wasn't for Jordan, I wonder if sneaker culture would even be a thing now. If they would even be making a Space Jam sequel now, if it wasn't Jordan in the title role, in the original. At the time, no other athlete with zero acting experience, and zero acting skills to be honest, would be put as the main character in an actual feature-length movie that was released in theaters.
None of that shit matters. Use my freaking French.
It was just crazy, and that's how popular Michael Jordan was. And Funko did a great job with the pop. I mean, the only thing I would change is that this pop, either the common should have had the tongue sticking out, or there should have been a chase with the tongue sticking out. That would have been just totally awesome. Alright guys, that was my list of the top 10 90s Funko Pops. Let me know in the comments below whether you agree or disagree, what your top 10 would be, or what pops you think I should have added to this list. Alright, thanks for watching and take it easy.